Hi everyone, this is Anthony O'Flynn coming to you from the Sunshine Coast. And the sun's actually come out today. It's absolutely incredible considering all the rain we've had over the last few days and expected into next week. So the federal election is looming, and two things to indicate firstly from this video is that I am not a member of any political party. I don't support any political party. I am having a very pragmatic and Machiavellian attitude towards the election, and this, in my view, the conversation in the freedom movement, alternative movement, has been extremely emotional leading up to the election, which has been counterproductive. There is not enough rational, logical, coherent thought, viewpoints and opinions being expressed as to the solutions of how to basically get out of this mess that we're in here in Australia. And we have a huge opportunity this election, and I'll be making several videos leading up to the election this week, but I just wanted to make this introductory one first to lay the framework for our mindset moving forward and moving into this election. Of course, some people have already made up their mind who they're going to vote for, and to make that clear, I'm not advocating any one candidate, one party, or in this way, but it's a solution-based approach, because we need to understand that the governments in Australia at state and federal level have basically declared war on the Australian way of life, and all the measures, the mandates, the restrictions, all the tyranny has been wound back deliberately prior to this election to keep the status quo. And the status quo is the ALP-LNP coalition. And as long as that remains intact after this election, the ultimate powers that be couldn't care less who is a puppet, who is declared the Prime Minister, or what particular party forms government, providing it is one of those two. And we can see just how controlled this narrative is in the mainstream media when there is a debate between the Prime Minister and the so-called opposition, a live debate. And it's basically railroading people's viewpoints and opinions into the red or the blue. And they're basically, as we know, just two wings of the same bird. And why are not all the other parties invited to put their policies forward? They may not form government, but they're still an integral part of the Australian political landscape. And yet they're completely ignored. It's just the leaders' debate between option A and option B. And ultimately, there's no real difference. The agenda will go forward regardless of the puppet, the front man in place. And this is the way it has been for the entire structure of this so-called democracy, where we're effectively only given two choices. And there are some renegade, minor type, other influential characters that sometimes get voted in, sometimes don't, do deals to maintain their own political influence and generate their own political outcomes. And the status quo remains intact. And the status quo will remain intact as long as this perpetual ALP-LNP coalition exists. So my view on this is to take the emotion out of it and look at it as simple as this. This is my overall approach and the outcome that I personally am looking for this election. How do we put the brakes on, slow down, remove and inflict electoral damage on the LNP-ALP coalition? Therefore, any seat that is lost by the Liberal Party, by the National Party, by the Labor Party, by the Greens Party is a victory for the Australian people at this election. Now, as I said, the Australian government has basically destroyed our rights, liberties, freedoms, human rights over the course of the pandemic, and there is absolutely no guarantee that that is finished in any way. Some of these apartheid measures are still intact regarding various professions across Australia. And the bigger problem, and a side point we have from that, is that there are still millions of people in Australia that are oblivious to this and oblivious to this totalitarian agenda. So really, we have to start from the beginning of this process and understand that any seat that is lost by the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Labor Party, the Greens, to any candidate at all is a victory for the Australian people. I cannot emphasise that enough. And the squabbling and the division and the arguments and the infighting and the lies that have been told about some of the candidates, some of the parties, it just reflects such a childish immaturity that beggars belief, considering the severity of the crisis that we're actually undergoing and experiencing here in Australia, a very crisis of our actual way of life. So for this reason, if we start from that basic premise that we are seeking to remove ALP, LNP, coalition, and all of the periphery around that, and install any candidates to the parliament, then for me, that is a huge victory right there. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there's a lot of good people in the freedom movement, the awakening community, freedom parties, the minor parties, who have made a really heroic effort, very courageous, and really have given up a lot of their time and energy to put themselves forward and offer themselves up as candidates who literally, they have zero chance of being elected. It's an unfortunate truth, but it's just the way they are. They're not going to get the numbers. To get voted into the Senate, the federal Senate in Australia, you need about, in Queensland, you need about 500,000 votes. So it is no joke getting elected. It translates into about approximately 1 in 7 votes across the states, depending on the population. So if you as a voter are going to vote, particularly in the Senate, for one of these minor candidates, then you really are wasting your vote, because they're not going to get voted in. They haven't got enough numbers. But if you actually vote for one of the more significant minor parties, such as UAP, One Nation, and this will vary across the state, and this will vary across the candidates, because there are independents in the House of Reps from Tasmania, from Warringah, from Wangaratta, Benalla, that area in northeast Victoria, and also one, I believe, from South Australia. But it's a lot of votes, and basically what we have to consider is, how are we going to go about doing this? And then what has been the biggest development I've seen that's of interest, at least to me, in this political campaign, is the education of the Australian people around preferential voting. And it is by design that so few people know how preferential voting works, and that basically there is this attitude, well, I'll vote for my favourite candidate first that might not be one of the major parties, but then I'm more of a Liberal or Labor voter, so I'll vote them second. The only thing you get out of this video is that that is absolutely the worst thing you can do, then that is good. Because these candidates in preferential voting, you can think of it in a way that it would be considered to be percentage voting. And if you are basically giving a sort of preference to one of those major parties, you vote them second, you vote them third, you vote them fourth, that preference can actually be of huge influence as the preferences are counted and the various candidates are eliminated, to come to the final conclusion of who will win that particular seat, if it's in the Senate or the House of Reps. So this idea of the percentage means that that percentage that you give second, third, fourth, wherever in your list of preferences, could actually become extremely important as the votes go deeper and deeper into the preferences. So this is by design to keep people in a state of ignorance, of course, that the preferences, oh, I vote one. It's the whole mantra around vote one. But actually voting two, voting three, voting four, voting five could actually determine the outcome of that seat as a much greater percentage of your vote than what you could possibly imagine when you're standing in the voting booth on Saturday, or however you choose to vote, whenever you choose to vote, by postal votes, whatever. So for this reason, in the House of Reps, you need to vote to get rid of this duopoly, it's total fascism in Australia. We are in a state of total crisis in this country. Vote those major parties last. It's as simple as that. And in the Senate, you only have to number 1 to 6 if you vote above the line. And so the preferences that you give will make a difference, and they will perhaps shape the election in a way that you won't necessarily perceive at the time of your vote, or the way that you are perceiving the electoral landscape as we lead up to this election. So the preferences are very important. I mean, they are so terrified now that they're preferencing each other, the majors, rather than the freedom parties. What does that tell you about this idea that I'm expressing in this video, and many other people are putting forward, that this entire system is under control by this domain of these two parties that basically have one ideology that just fluctuates slightly from party to party, from leader to leader. But basically there is no ultimate difference. It's just branding, it's just marketing, it's just spin. And both parties are guilty of it. And we talk about, like, the people think the Liberals are this right-wing party, this capitalistic liberal party. Well, what has just happened in the last 2 years? It was basically total socialism. Regardless of the need for it or not, it's not talked about in the mainstream media at all that the JobKeeper total amount spent was $100 billion. That's a socialist program right there. Free money for not working. And I understand the perceived justification of it, but don't forget that it was the government that stopped you working in the first place. That's complete not a liberal policy whatsoever. I mean, this whole topic of what the government's done, plenty to say about that. I believe, and I'm confident, that the deciding factor in this election actually will be the Australian people's absolute disgust in Scott Morrison. That will be the deciding factor in the election. He is probably the most universally hated politician we've ever had here in Australia, even more so than John Howard. And I think that will be the deciding factor. It's going to be very complicated as far as what happens in terms of voting crossover with the various people in the states, particularly Victoria, Western Australia, Queensland, who have been the most ruthless with the lockdowns and the tyranny and everything, border closures, etc., all being Labor-controlled states, will mean some of those votes will go into Liberal areas. And also in Queensland, in the last election, the first preference, the vote towards Labor, was very, very low and was one of the major deciding factors in the actual victory of the coalition. So these factors will play out and have various influences. I am pretty confident that ALP will win the election. I don't support Albanese at all, or the ALP in any way, but but that's what's going to happen as far as I can see it now. And as I said, I think Morrison is finished. I think that his conduct in regard to the fires, the floods, just basically taking no action to stop the lease of the Port of Darwin, his total perceived weakness in leadership in regard to border closures and not overruling the states or taking any action to counter the policies of the states, the mess of the economy, and I mean, the guy's an international embarrassment, basically. You saw that all the leaders shunned him at the G20 meeting. I mean, there's just so many things there. I could go on about it, but he is basically, in my view, regarded as being so un-Australian by the electorate that I find it very difficult to imagine that he has got a chance of actually being re-elected. I think that he is the biggest problem that the Liberal Party have, and the Labor Party have a lot of problems as well. I mean, a vote for them is basically a vote for the socialist agenda, for this all kinds of policies around climate change, and I mean, it is we're in a dire way here in Australia, but we have to look at this process in stages, that it will take at least another election cycle, perhaps one more, to really inflict enough electoral damage and give enough impetus in the Australian psyche that there is a third party emerging. And the potential for that obviously is UAP. I mean, when we see a lot of the minor parties, they're campaigning on various topics regarding the fact that Australia is ruled as a corporation, that we don't follow the Constitution, all these basic policies around medical mandates, all these things. All these are relevant issues, and all these are very honourable issues, but it's not at the forefront of the Australian electorate. And this is what so many of these minor parties just completely overlook. And the fact is that these minor parties, the major parties, they do a lot of focus groups to determine what's important, what topics are important, and they push that forward in the campaign model. And the Freedom parties go on this heroic thing with this crusade, with this kind of crusade for whatever particular focus that they have, the sort of niche. But what they fail to understand, the single issue parties, especially, is that this is not what the voters are looking for. Look at what the major issues that the major parties campaign on. They're always things like jobs, roads, health. Strong borders was the big election campaign that Abbott won. That was one of the big policies, big features. And these are like more broader issues. Good government, economic growth, economic stability, all these things, which none of those governments have ever provided, by the way. They're just simply transferring wealth from people who consider themselves middle class but are working class to the elite. Look at the failure of the Morrison government to tax corporations, for example, in Australia. I mean, there's just so many things. But yet the Australian people get herded into this left-right paradigm at election time without taking off the blinkers. And the minor parties, the independents, everyone is given little, if any, airtime in the mainstream media by design. And then this is how this duopoly is maintained in the Australian political landscape. So this is why it's important to vote the majors last, but to think about the candidate that you're voting for. Do they genuinely have 500,000 votes behind them in the Senate? And then the House of Representatives, even more difficult to get voted into. But having said that, there's never a greater time than this election that there will be a changing of the guard, more seats becoming independent, becoming the minor parties. But it is a very delicate situation with the Greens, because they now have seats in the Senate in every state, and there is an argument that's been put forward that they're likely to win even more seats in the Senate in this election. So this is this perceived idea of the rich rewards of socialism. Study a history book, any history book, socialism has never succeeded in any country, in any capacity, in any economy. It is a recipe for complete disaster. If you vote for socialism and you think it's going to be great because you're going to get extra money at Austudy, extra money from your various social security payouts, all the other handouts from the government, this ultimately is the problem with socialism, is that somebody else always pays for the recipients of payments, of subsidies, all these things. And then the actual money coming in to the government to pay for all these schemes is smaller and smaller and smaller. And then more and more loans are taken out, and gradually the economy fails completely. It's just study a history book. It's like textbook logic. So I've got more to say about this in more detail, but it's time to come together in the freedom movement. The bickering, the division, the pettiness, it's quite remarkable actually. But there it is. There it is. We need to unite, and we need to consider what parties, what candidates can genuinely make inroads into this toxic political culture that is of no service to the Australian people, and the Australian people need to realise that it doesn't have to be this way. Thanks for watching. Plenty more to come. Enjoy the sunshine. Have a great weekend.